Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's oldest and largest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is William Haas Evans, and I'm honored to be here with you today. I'm with Eric Schockmel, the writer and director of Tuning into the Future, a film about Hugo Gernsback, which is showing at the 24th Miami Jewish Film Festival. First of all, Eric, mazel tov on the release of your film.
Thank you.
Before digging into the film, I hope you'll forgive my indulgence of digging a little bit into your background as a designer foremost, but also as an artist. It says that you graduated from the École de Recherche Graphique in Brussels, and you went on and got your master's degree in graphic communications or communications arts. So I thought it might be fun to start with a provocation, since being a designer, you know what that is going to entail. Starting with a quote, it said that designers have a prescriptive job. We suggest how the world might be. To some extent, we are futurists. I want to know to what extent you believe that futurism informs your art and craft as a designer.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of the question.
To what extent do you think that design in your art and craft of design is informed by futurism?
Oh, so my practice in specific, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
That's you started with the tough nut to crack, I guess. Yeah, to be honest, I think a lot of times beyond, let's say, the basic research, a lot of the creative process, I guess, comes kind of intuitively. I would say, I don't know if this is an answer, but I just jump into the thing that comes into my mind right now. One of the questions I was actually really interested about in the beginning of researching the movie, but which maybe never really found its way into the storyline, was the way in which futurism and actual design are kind of always in a perpetual feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really hard to disentangle those. And I think that's why I probably can't really give you an answer, a precise answer to your questions, because I mean, I've grown up on like the usual pop culture tropes, and a lot of which, you know, is kind of it's part of this whole science fiction, fantasy, stories that everyone knows, and I guess subconsciously, you know, these things play a role whenever you try to come up with a new idea, and you're always confronted with past visions of the future and alternate versions of the future, one timeline of which, you know, if you want to see it that way, is ours.
Thanks, Eric. So my next question was really, you know, as a fan of science fiction, I wanted to know whether your interest in science fiction started before your interest in design, or did your passion for design lead you to discovering science fiction and then Hugo Gernsback?
I think the interest for science fiction has always been there, kind of latently. I think I always thought of myself as a science fiction fan until I found out about fandom, like actual science fiction fandom, which I did find out with the research for the movie. And then I realized that I was kind of just, you know, a hobbyist of a fan, because real fandom is like really engaged and really involved. And I don't think I was ever that involved, but I was kind of generally consuming and enjoying science fiction content in parallel to designing. And I've never really made a direct connection between the design practice and actual science fiction. I'd have to say. But then the movie came along, and as part of my research, I kind of re-immersed myself. I read a lot of science fiction novels just to like get into the spirit, to kind of see where the discipline ended up, that I was going to talk about its origin. And that made it kind of reignited my interest in the field, definitely.
Nice. Was there anything really surprising that you found out about Gernsback as you were doing your research, that it got you really excited or really passionate about the project?
Well, the sheer countless number of things that got me passionate is really what made me decide to make this movie. I mean, there is an effort in Luxembourg that goes back to the 90s to get a documentary about Hugo Gernsback done, and they always, I think they mainly failed from the lack of visual material, especially film archive material, which there still isn't much of. But so I met this our producer one day many years ago, and after our first meeting, I had told him about what I was doing, the animation things, kind of my projects that were moving image related. And at some point he asked me if I wanted to have a look at this file that he had in his drawer, because he thought maybe animation could be part of a solution to this problem. And this problem was the biographical documentary of Hugo Gernsback. Right. And I started reading it, and I thought this must be fiction, because it's it's hilarious, but it's also kind of a little bit crazy. It's incredible in some ways. And close friends with Tesla, but also related to Edison, and kind of inventor of so many things, and the father of science fiction, and more and more and more and more and more, and born in Luxembourg. And I thought, how is it possible that no one knows about this guy? Because and then I was asking around my friends, people who also grew up on science fiction and pop culture, and it's very limited, the amount of people who actually are aware of him. And I thought, how can this be? It's impossible. Like, he has so many iconic influences on the field and on pop culture in general. And so many crazy stories about him, the way he presented himself, his alter egos. It's like, it's just a story waiting to be told. And that was immediately, for me, it was clear, like, I have to tell this story before someone else snatches it away from me, because it's obvious that it has to be made one day. So yeah,
I absolutely, I as well, when I was watching your film, I was so shocked to some extent, because I at least grew up on science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction, and I remember even as a teenager when I would be perusing the bookstores back when bookstores existed. And whenever I saw something that said Hugo Award winner, I'd be like, oh, I'm going to get that. And so many of the books that I read, I knew were Hugo Award winners. But even when I first started thinking about doing this interview with you, I didn't make the connection between Hugo Gernsback and the Hugo Award. Like, even that was discontinuous for me. So I thought it was really fascinating, such a huge influence that he had. Turning just a little bit, I had a couple of questions that to draw our audience in. What I also found really interesting, and this isn't different for a lot of at least American Jews that came to the United States or had grandparents and great-grandparents that came here, but it doesn't seem like his Jewish background played a prominent role in his life. And I was wondering if you found that his background and culture may have predisposed him towards becoming an inventor, or maybe more the immigrant story of being an outsider. And I wondered if what your thoughts were on that.
Right, that's actually a very interesting angle to Gernsback that I'm not getting asked much. So thank you, because it's something that I would have loved to elaborate on more. And but I'll kind of cut the question up into several bits, because it's easier. So first of all, his Jewish background, I researched a lot about him. I read a lot of what he wrote. I tried as best I could to, retrace his steps, a century later. And I have to say, I didn't find many traces where his, Jewish background would have played a huge role in his view of the world or his work. But then again, I would assume, I think his parents must have been practicing, like when his dad passed away, he was buried at the Jewish cemetery in Luxembourg. I think they must have had some form of like a bit more active practice of the religion at home. So I kind of I was going to say something else. Oh, right, yeah. In the early 60s, he seems to have been planning a trip back to Luxembourg, which I don't think ever materialized, but he contacted someone associated with the Jewish community and the synagogue here in Luxembourg to inquire about a good journalist that would cover his stay in Luxembourg, someone trustworthy and who would cover appropriately his visit back to the country, which I found odd that he would choose, that's where he would go and ask for this kind of thing. But I guess there must have been some kind of thinking behind this logic that that's where you would go to get the credible advice. That's one thing. The other thing about his upbringing, it's difficult. I mean, yes, he was an outsider, he was an immigrant, and in some ways he has a typical maybe immigrant approach to things, in like seeing maybe the United States from an outsider's perspective, but he was also very privileged at the same time. I think he came to America with some wealth in his pockets, which enabled him to get like a running start. He had his brother who was elsewhere or soon after joined him, and he started immediately a very successful business. So they had their networks, which supported them very well. But I do think that growing up in Luxembourg, and that's something where I kind of draw from my own experience in a way to try to understand him a little bit. I think, kind of coming from a Germanic or German background, because his parents moved to Luxembourg from Germany, but also being very close to the French mentality, and Luxembourg being this kind of in between, kind of mediating, kind of understanding both parties, and kind of being very permeable to cultural influence. I think that really allowed him, when he arrived in America, where you could, pretty much invent who you wanted to be, right, to build up this persona that he ended up having, this kind of cosmopolitan, very well-read, very dapper guy who maybe, behind the facade was maybe someone much shyer and much more reserved. But I think it allowed him to build up this facade, this persona that he liked playing. He wanted to be seen as a little bit exotic, with all the languages and the wine and the cigars and these kind of things. So I think it allowed him to kind of get a very quick grasp on being an American, coming from a European background.
Well, there's another thing that you just kind of brought up that got me thinking about, this notion of Luxembourg being this in-between space to some extent between Germanic and French cultures. And to some extent, do you think that he kind of played that role in the persona that he projected when he came to America, of playing that in between the rigorous scientific community, with the inventors and the scientists and the Nikola Teslas and the Edisons, and more of the pop culture and the fascination with wireless and the fascination with these emerging technologies that and the wondrous life that it could create, and kind of acted as a translator, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very crucial actually to understanding Gernsback, because he, even though he started some studies in electrical engineering, and even though science was his religion, he was very unlike what we now consider like formal scientists. Like he did not. I mean, he was an inventor, but at a time where you could still invent things in your garage alone, and soon after that changed, you had to be like a big corporation or big organizations. So he was this kind of tinkerer, but he didn't write, scientific papers. He wasn't a professional scientist in that sense, I think. So he appealed much more to this, the popular but also maybe spiritual idea what science could mean for us, rather than like the nitty-gritty details of actual scientific research. And in another way in which he was this mediator, this in between, is actually something that just I read a few months ago. Actually, someone wrote a review of the movie. Someone in Italy who I forget the name, unfortunately, but I posted it on my Twitter timeline. Someone who saw the movie at the festival, and he wrote very elegantly and eloquently that Gernsback was like a hub between sort of classical, in a way, classical time and modernity. So he took the world of the 19th century, Jules Verne, this kind of almost, in terms of science fiction, still kind of Baroque world, and he made it ready to be consumed in the 20th century. He made it like a mainstream, a product that you could sell, that would have platforms, that would have media in which to consume them, and he made it a brand almost like. And I think that's very crucial for the discipline to just to take off as it did, and to get many writers, to get the diversity that we see now in writing and reading and consuming in all other forms. And I think he's very crucial in that sense. And then as you say, the Hugo Award that so many people know but don't connect to him.
Right.
That's kind of like the little asterisk to this whole story, where it's actually showing this tiny thing, but really underneath, I think.
There was one other, there's so many asterisks to Hugo, right? Another one that I really appreciated that you touched upon near the end of the film, is that this interface between, hard science and popular culture, or what can we do with this, almost preceding modernism, right? And you see this kind of carried through in his influence on like the homebrew computer club that started up in the 70s. Steve Jobs played a very similar role initially. He was not actually an inventor. He was to some extent a tinker a little bit, but really it was Wozniak that was the inventor. But Jobs was a fantastic interface to popular culture, and how do you make it useful and usable and easy and desirable, and packaging it up to be consumable by a general public. And it's almost like Gernsback inspired all of these things 40, 50, 60 years later, inspired Homebrew Computer Club, which is just, the ham radio operating for the 70s and for the 80s, just as transistors were becoming the new wireless, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what's really interesting about Gernsback is that, and I think also the reason why he never really became famous enough to warrant his role, is that he's always kind of this one step removed. Like you see something famous, and then you go to the roots of that, but then you have to go like one step further, which most people don't do. And that's where you find Gernsback. But you don't find him like once or twice. You consistently find him whenever you have something to do with technology, pop culture, right, science fiction. If you just go a couple of steps back down, he's there. And it's just, if it was just a couple of times, it could be coincidence. He would be just like semi-clever guy, involved in something big, but he's not like right there. He's kind of around a corner or two, but consistently. And it's always like this presence that that intrigued me. That I think he deserved a little bit more, to be a little bit more in the limelight, which I think he would have enjoyed as well.
Right. Because he did seem like, a little bit of a showman, I think, or at least, like to perform in public to some extent, even if he might have been very reserved or shy, or maybe even, and you don't say outright whether or not he may have been autistic, but you kind of hint that he may have been on the spectrum. We don't know because we didn't have tests at the
Yeah,
time
yeah.
for that thing. Um, but it's fascinating what you say about just around the corner or one step additionally removed, because there's so much that permeates modern popular culture in America that if you dig a little bit, right, Wonder Woman was an amazing hit, but Wonder Woman coming from Superman, which initially starts off as stories that were in his publications that influence entire generations of people that were imagining, the superhero genre, which is completely derivative of the ideas that he was promoting in the 20s, which I think is phenomenal, right?
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I still kind of keep finding things out. After the movie was done, I was contacted by someone who's researching and working on I think like, yeah, some kind of comic for Marvel, which explores the roots of Marvel. And so it was two people that started Marvel, and it turns out that one of them, so not the illustrator, but the other one, I don't know the names, but it would be easy to find out. But so the one who sort of wrote the stories and did all the business dealings, used to work for Gernsback, and then after, as a young man, and after that, after he worked for Gernsback, the company was in the same building as Gernsback and had and was distributing Gernsback's magazines. And again, like with like a big franchise like that, a big name in science fiction fantasy like that, again you're at you again arrive at Gernsback, and I didn't even know when I was making the movie, but it doesn't matter, because there's already so much, and there's also so much that I had to leave out of the movie. It would have been, would have become too long, and
So it sounds like you're hinting that there's going to be a director's cut of the documentary.
Oh, and no, I'm happy to have arrived at the end of this cut, and yeah, to make it out the other end.
Yeah,
It was a long process, but
I bet. So it took how long? About 9 years to pull it all
well,
together.
so between the first contact with the subject and the release was 7 years. I didn't work on that full time permanently. It was, for some of the years, it was kind of like an on and off thing where I worked on that and had my other projects. But definitely 2 years or so towards the end, it was almost full time, because it was just so time consuming. Uh, yeah, the editing that story together was quite hard, because you need to find a structure that's going to work as a, as a in terms of film language that people connect to, that people follow. I didn't want it to be too, I don't know, I'll say impressionist and kind of all over the place. I wanted it to have some kind of arc that you can
Right.
follow. And he's a hard person to fit into these kind of patterns.
Yeah.
He's not the underdog really, but it's not rags from riches. It's not the other way around. It's always when you think you have like a firm handle on the story, you find out something that it's not quite like that. It's not quite like you thought. It's always something a little bit more complicated. And then the question is always like, how, it's like almost a scientific process that, or you try to make, like when you make science tangible to the general public, like how much can you simplify while still being correct? You have to weigh like what's the academic right thing to do, what's the entertainment, the right thing to do to keep an audience entertained in a cinema, so they don't think they throw away their money by watching the film. So it was a lot of these judgments to make while digesting the facts of his life.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned a lot earlier was just the lack of archival footage, right? Led you to, and it's an obstacle, especially when you're first unpacking and doing your research and saying, okay, what materials do I have available to me to structure some kind of a narrative arc to this? And you find, well, you're missing a bunch of archival footage, so you have to design, if you will, right, a intervention into that by introducing animation as a mechanism to kind of carry the story forward. Were there other obstacles that you found when you were putting the film together that needed to be overcome for you to be able to say, yes, I'm moving in a direction where I will have a finished, product or story that I'll feel good about presenting to the public?
Um, yeah, I mean, obstacles, certainly what I mentioned just earlier, the fact that it's quite hard to fit the facts of his life and his work, his personality into neat formulas that would make for easy filmmaking. That was definitely an obstacle. But yes, also I think a big obstacle was really to kind of get to the root of who he really was. I
Right.
think it gets easier. I mean, okay, there's always a limit as to how far you can understand someone that you're not meeting, or that is so far removed in time. But it helps to see people, how they move, how they talk, to hear them. And there were some audio clips that we had from the beginning, and photos. And then we discovered one of his grandchildren gave me this video clip where he's with his family, like outside of his flat, which was a silent film. And then quite late in the process, we discovered some video footage, which was part of a BBC reportage a few years before he died. I think 1964 it was from, I'm not sure, or 65.
Hey, Eric, are there any other things that you wanted to leave the viewers with before I let you go? Because I really appreciated this conversation. I love the fact that you've dug this up, and you've kind of delved deep into Hugo Brunswick and his life, and really the amazing impact that he's had on, I would say, society. I mean, we can't imagine a life now without computer mediated social networks. We can't imagine a life now without pop films like the Marvel and the DC films that are coming out pretty much constantly. Like, there's so many aspects to just modern living that he had an influence on. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us about your journey or about the film itself?
Well, I'll let the viewers discover the story for themselves. I definitely hope that they will feel like they learned something, but also mainly that they had an entertaining time. But without wanting to, say too much about it, that people will hopefully see for themselves. I was really surprised in the end, because it's easy to talk about Gernsback and talk about the film in terms of the science fiction angle. I really hope that what will not get lost too much in the memory of after people have seen it is really that I think there's quite a big lesson that I find that could be learned even today from Gernsback, in the sense that he was really like his belief in science. I think it has gotten for me even now like a new dimension, if you consider the times we're living in right now, with being in the middle of a pandemic. I think his almost blind faith in science is kind of contrary to some of the things we see today in some places that, I don't know, I can't help but think they make things worse. And I think he would have shown us the right direction. And I think the lesson we can get from Gernsback today is it's larger than just a pop culture influence. And
Yeah, there is an
that
entire thread, right? Like, and I wish we had hours, because I think we could pick apart, right, not just the pop culture influence, but there was, a fascinating optimism back in the 1920s, 1930s, all the way up until really 1945, technology was going to bring about some forms of utopianism, right? It was going to remove a lot of the day-to-day hassle of labor and work, and it was going to make our lives easier so that we could move up in Maslow's hierarchy. And then the pendulum kind of swung in the other direction. And we were only looking at the negative impacts of technology on society or culture, human relations. And it's been a really interesting, this progress in our culture, at least American culture, about our views towards science and the degree to which we respect expertise in science,
Right. Yeah.
as a source of truth or a source of legitimate observation about the world around us, and how we might live better lives. And then, a negation almost of science, or a negation of intellectualism. And
Yeah.
we have some significant challenges that we face.
Yeah. I
Climate
think
change.
it's important that when you say that, up the optimism up to 1945, the pendulum swings back, and he keeps going in a way, like his optimism is never broken. And in the way, the thing that then started slowly to make him irrelevant in science fiction, at least, I kind of feel like that kind of resonates today, and it's a bit of a sad thing that he became that irrelevant, because there is something to be learned from that.
Right, from that optimism or that ideal that we can have a
Yes.
better future, or that we can participate in the creation of a better future. And
Yes.
and I think you're right. We need a little bit of that optimism today, if nothing more than to spur people to go study science and study math and try to actually be a positive influence. Right? Might be a lesson to learn from him.
I'd like to think so. Well, thank you very much as well for your engaged questioning, and it feels really rewarding to talk to someone who clearly has engaged with the work, and who asks very very relevant questions about it. So I really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate your time and the energy and passion you put into the project, but also just contributing the film to the festival. I think a lot of people are going to learn quite a bit, and maybe relate to quite a bit too, because a lot of us have that immigrant story in our background. And so there's just so many threads to pull on with your subject matter. So I really appreciate you bringing this to us.
Well, thanks to you for showing it to so many people. It's appreciated.